This is the Northern...
The agreement, agenda items 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9 are recorded by Hansard. Agreed?
Yep.
Apologies from Judith Cochran. Ian McRae. Leslie Cree has said he will be here about 11 a.m. Any other apologies? No. Draft minutes, pages 5 to 9. Members content the record.
Chairman, I thought I sent an apology last week by email. I'm 99% sure that.
We'll check that.
Aye.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, matters arising. Summary table request, pages 12 to 16 for noting. And we'll now go on to a closed session for the budget scrutiny preparation workshop.
Assembly Committee Room.
How did you everybody get one?
Yeah.
Sorry for running over that.
Always.
Do you check these for me?
Oh, yeah, if you've got them, yeah. Thank you.
Could be scrutinised.
It's my boss that wants those, not me. If there are any more feedback questionnaires, maybe if you could put them to the committee staff, that would be great. I'll pass them on to me.
Morning, Bridget.
Morning.
Very welcome. Members, moving on to the departmental spending plan briefing. Thank you, Eunice. Can advise members that this session had originally been allocated 40 minutes. However, the Secretariat received notice from DFP officials yesterday afternoon that they were not in a position to provide papers or brief the committee as previously agreed. This today will hamper the committee's efforts to prepare a coordinated report, including on its scrutiny of DFP's own budget. Can I also remind members that they agreed at its meeting on the 2nd of April this year that, and I quote, the committee continues its practice of seeking an explanation in person from the senior departmental officials responsible for postponing oral briefings at short notice or providing late papers. The DFP officials have therefore been asked to attend the meeting as planned and provide an explanation. Bridget, given the DFP Permanent Secretary was obviously before the committee last week and he did give a commitment that papers will be provided in time, what explanation is there for this 11th hour postponement and how does this reflect on Department of Finance and Personnel in terms of leading by example?
Well, in this case, it's really the significant level of reduction that we're dealing with, obviously, in the budget has meant that this is a particularly challenging paper to produce. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to do it within the time available. We did make every effort to do it within the time we had available, and it was only really yesterday that it became apparent that, you know, we weren't actually going to be able to get ourselves to the point where we would have a paper that we were content to present to yourselves, and then at that time we notified you that this was the case.
Would you agree it's particularly damaging to the reputation of the department that this is happening on a regular basis now?
Well, I mean, I think this is probably not particularly regular occurrence for Finance Division. We have had a relatively good record up until this time, and I do attribute this particular delay to the challenging nature of the paper that we're trying to produce, particularly in the timescale available to.
But obviously, in terms of the department in general, there's been a number of occasions now where members at the last minute have not received papers in good time in accordance with procedures, and you know, this isn't something that is tenable in my view.
Well, I mean, I think the Permanent Secretary made it quite clear last week that he would agree with you and that he would make every effort to improve the department's performance in this respect in the future. And certainly I'll do everything in my power to ensure that my papers reach your desk. as soon as I can.
Is it a resource issue?
With this, it's not so much a resource issue as the scale of the task issue in the time frame available.
Paragraph 5.2 of the draft budget states that ministers will seek to publish more detailed breakdowns of proposed expenditure on their departmental websites. When is DFP going to publish such a breakdown for this committee to scrutinise?
We will, as I say, we are making every effort to get ourselves to that point, and we will do that as soon as we possibly can.
When?
I'm not in a position to give you an exact time frame at the moment.
Could you give us a broad time frame?
As I say, we are working. It is my top priority at the moment, so I'm doing everything I can to get that done.
Well, it's your top
as soon as
priority.
I
You should have a
can.
broad time frame for when it can be done.
Well, it's not just myself that it's dependent on. Obviously, there are many levels of review within the department in terms of producing a paper, and it's particularly important that we get something like this right and that we don't publish something that subsequently emerges to be unachievable or unreliable.
What assurance can the committee be given that all ministers will do this when the finance minister hasn't done it?
I'm not really in a position to answer that question, I don't think. I can only do what I can in relation to the DFP paper.
Okay. Deputy Chair.
The paper that you would have for today, would it normally go to the Minister?
It
for
would,
approval?
yes.
Has it gone to the Minister?
It goes through a number of different processes through the department in order to arrive at the committee, so it wouldn't really be appropriate for me to comment on specific steps that it's gone through at this stage.
Well, why not?
It's in progress.
Surely it's not a top secret issue. I mean, has it gone to the Minister or has it not?
It's undergoing review within the department.
Well, how is the committee here, how are we to tell where the delay is in the system if you won't give us the information we need on that?
Well, I think that's really an internal departmental matter for us to work through and to ensure that we do make every effort to get papers to yourselves on time.
Yeah, but it's also the role of this committee to ensure that we get the information that we need in a timely fashion.
Yes, I understand
So
that.
we expect cooperation from the department on that.
Yes.
We don't seem to be getting it here today. Anyway, we'll leave it at that, Chair.
Thanks, Deputy Chair. Bridget, just when you're here, could you give us a view on the research lines of questioning paper that we have in members' packs today? Obviously, the department has a deadline of tomorrow to issue a written response to that. Can we have an assurance that that will happen by tomorrow's deadline?
I haven't actually been dealing with that particular case, so I'm unsighted, to be honest with you, on where that is at the moment.
Are you aware of that research paper?
I'm aware of it, yes.
How are you aware of it, and how do you not know if the department is preparing to respond in time or not?
I've been asked for a part input into the response, so I'm aware of it from that respect. I had indicated at the time I was asked for a part response that I would be happy to provide an oral response at the session that we had on the budget paper, so I haven't yet been asked for any further information on that, and as I say, I'm unsighted as to exactly where that is in the process within the department at the moment.
So in terms of your own input into that, that hasn't been signed off on yet?
As I say, I had offered an oral input rather than a written input, and I haven't yet been informed that that's a problem, so...
Are you expecting the department to come back and ask for a written input before tomorrow's deadline?
I suspect that may be a logical consequence of the fact that I haven't been able to provide you with oral input today, and certainly I have something available once that request issues to me that would be able to go within that time frame.
Okay. John?
Thanks, Chair. On some occasions, I maybe have some sympathy for officials having to come and tell committees that it's not prepared. I have to say, Chair, any sympathy I had maybe went slightly out the window in your response to the Vice Chair's question. I mean, is my understanding, is there a paper? The paper has been prepared, it just hasn't been signed off yet.
There is an initial draft, but I mean that paper then needs to go through. I mean, development of these papers is always an iterative process, and it's not uncommon for several levels of review to occur where the paper would be revised and rewritten in, and so you know it's not got to the point where there is a final paper yet.
And I accepted would go through reviews and maybe redrafts. The simple question was how far along that process is it? Is it with the minister, yes or no?
It's in the middle of that process of being reviewed and redrafted.
So it's not at the ministerial level yet. It's not ready to. It's not. The blockage isn't at the minister's.
It's not. The minister has not yet received a final draft that he's content with.
Right. So he has seen the initial draft. That's the point. It's in that process. The minister has seen the draft. There is a blockage at that point that it hasn't been signed off on.
As I say, it needs to be redrafted. There is a need for it to go through that iterative process and to go through a series potentially of redrafts before it is at a point that the minister is content to issue it to the committee.
So that would seem to me that that's where the blockage is that the minister hasn't signed it off. We don't have a paper. We're already very far behind in this process. It's a very difficult paper to prepare, a very difficult budget for us to scrutinise, but it's not making any of our jobs any easier by the constant delays. Unless, you know, have we a time frame of when this is going to be signed off? I mean, are we going to be in a position to do it next Wednesday?
I can't. I mean, as I say, I'm making it. We're working on this as our top priority. But you know, we need to make sure that the paper that comes to yourselves can withstand scrutiny, as I'm sure you'll appreciate.
I do. I'm just get concerned that somehow it doesn't get signed off, and we head into Christmas recess without this level. You know, not only. And this is probably a concern that we're highlighting for other committees as well, as to what departments are going to come up with and what information, and to not have a time frame in such a short window that we're having to deal with this and scrutinised, I think is totally unacceptable. I could accept it if you were saying we need another week, but the fact is you can't even tell us that today.
Okay, Michaela?
Yeah, Chair, thank you. My question's been answered when you made your comment on the written response. It should be by tomorrow. But just to say, I suppose, making a comment that we had Mr. Sterling here last week, and he did apologise profusely about the same issue that we have arrived at here today. I suppose, Bridget, you've got the short straw and you're the bearer of the bad news today. But I mean, just last week, I'm sure when Mr. Sterling was here last week, they would have had sight of that the initial draft at last week wouldn't have been ready. I'm sure, you know, give or take a few days. I mean, our work here is very important, and we do set out an agenda on the issues that we are dealing with, and it's just unfortunate that we hadn't known sooner, other than today or this morning or late yesterday afternoon, so that we could have had something else on our agenda, because all of our business is very important, and we are coming up to Christmas recess and there's quite a bit in our agenda to get through. So it's just unfortunate, and it's unfortunate, Bridget, that you've got the short straw to come and give us that bad news, given the fact that you are Senior Finance Director. But you know, we had the Permanent Secretary here last week. Was he not aware of this issue last week, and knowing full well maybe that this item of business may not well have been before us today?
Martin?
Brigitte, I'm going to echo that sympathy. This is a bit like a Secret Service committee. I wasn't sure which committee I'd landed in when we got no answers to anything, although I do think that we have now answered the question that the Vice Chair put, that the Minister does have a draft response. Is that correct? The Minister has a document?
He has had a document, and he has indicated that he's not content with that document, and therefore he is waiting for final.
And I suppose one of our discussions earlier on today, before you come in, Brigitte, was really about how short this timeline for consultation is. and how many bites the cherry this committee would have. I presume we're now losing at least another week. The other thing I'd like to say is that last week when the Permanent Secretary was here, Mr Sterling, I said he was doing a sterling job. He had one late report last week, and this week he's no report. So I have to withdraw that. That's not, even by my estimation, that isn't a sterling job.
You turned so quickly.
But this is what, in my view, is unacceptable. Not that Bridget, you had to come here to break the bad news, but the Permanent Secretary should be here. You know, the old adage in business, bit of bad news, break it yourself. And I don't know where he is this morning. No doubt he's working on this draft that we can't see, but he should do the chair the courtesy, or perhaps this has happened already. He really should do the chair courtesy. The Permanent Secretary should of contacting him and maybe giving an explanation where it's possible, a little bit more detail about why the committee's been stood up, if not snubbed in this way. So I don't know, Chair, if that has happened. Perhaps the Permanent Secretary has been in touch with you.
No.
And I presume that the man at the ferry top, the Minister, hasn't been in touch either.
No, not yet.
Well, I think I think it's unfair of the Permanent Secretary, Bridget, as part of our sympathy for you. I think it's unfair that he didn't take a time himself to come up and let us down gently himself rather than sending you. But you can bring that message back to him.
Bridget, not to flog a dead horse, but you know, in terms of the Minister, since he came into office, I mean, members here would have been on this committee when Sammy Wilson was Minister, and I don't think we had this problem to the same extent as we have had since Simon Hamilton took office. So is it the case that it is the Minister's office that is frustrating this process?
I can't comment on that. I mean, I can only comment on the papers that I've prepared, and I know myself that this is only the second time I've been at this committee with a late paper, and the first time that there's been no paper. So I haven't seen any marked change in what's happened in relation to the papers I have experience of.
But are you finding that when papers going from yourself to the Minister's office, are they coming back at the same rate as they were when his predecessor was in post?
As I say, I haven't noticed a particular change in the rate of late papers in my experience.
Adrian?
Chair, I just don't see where you're coming from. I don't see how this would be in the Minister's interest to hold this paper away from us. Surely he'd be looking at our support on it. So sooner we'd have it and get through it and agree it or disagree it, whatever, you'd know where he stands. So I can't see why we're badgering and wanting so much. You know, different if it was a Permanent Secretary. I think, yeah, we should have a go at him, but not Bridget. Bridget's here sent out with a message. I think she's done fairly well on what she said. But I don't think there's any point in labouring it.
I do think, however, Aidan I agree with him partly. But the fact is we have to get to the bottom of this because this is a recurrent problem. So the blame.
Let's have a go at the Permanent Secretary.
The blame lies with, but the blame does lie with the Minister because he's accountable for his department as well. So I do think that the Minister's before us, hopefully in the next few weeks. So if that's not in the pipeline, perhaps we should bring that forward to ensure that it does answer questions around this. Bridget, thank you for it. Paul,
just before going off that, and appreciate that, and it is to come back on a point that there is an opportunity missed here. The timeline has actually shifted a further week. If it means having a special meeting of this committee to actually deal with this one item of business, because I would be fearful of actually dropping off the end of the Christmas recess and then running into a difficulty with actually getting everything through the Assembly before March and through all the committees and everything else that has to be done. So rather than create a problem, I appreciate this committee will show its willingness to actually put its shoulder to the wheel, to actually not delay the process. And if that means having a special committee and you as chair calling a committee to meet even some other day, even a Tuesday lunchtime, whatever that might be, if we need to do that, I would say I'd be keen to do that, but it doesn't take away from asking for an explanation.
Yeah.
That's the reason for delay. But so as we can't be seen as holding things up to allow things to progress, I think we show our willingness to have additional meetings if it's necessary.
Could I just say, I don't believe that any of the members here were badgering the witness.
I thought it was a Castlereagh.
We're here, we're here to get information.
Yes, but
and,
the question was asked 3 or 4 times.
Sorry, I'm speaking, if you don't mind. We're here to get information from witnesses. We're here to ask questions. And if asking questions is badgering, then we may all be silent.
Well, sometimes it might be better.
Okay.
Certainly in your case.
Okay, members. Bridget, in terms of next week then, the session will take place and we should have the papers in good time.
I will do everything in my power to ensure that's the case.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, can I remind members the committee usually leads a take note debate in plenary to give all MLAs the opportunity to debate the draft budget. Can I seek members' agreement to the wording for the draft motion for this debate and the suggested date of the 8th or 9th of December? This is on page 35 of the table packs. Members content?
Agreed, yeah.
Agreed. Moving on to the next session, preventative spending and investigative measures. Can I refer members to research paper 25 to 27 of your pack, the follow-up 28 to 29, and DAP response and earlier assembly research papers 31 through to 78.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can I welcome Dr. Bernie Stewart, the head of the Public Sector Reform Division, Peter Jacobson from the Central Expenditure Division. There was another witness?
No, that was a mistake.
Okay, that's all right. Do you want to make a brief opening statement
Yes,
and
I
then we'll
will
go to
do.
questions?
Thank you very much. So thanks for inviting us here today to talk about the preventative spending and the early intervention. We've read the research papers that your committee provided, and the one from 2011 and the 2 from this year. And they provide a lot of examples of early intervention and preventative initiatives, things like time to read, the homeowner flood protection and so on. So I think what your papers are really telling us is that whilst there have been some moves in preventative spending, there's quite a lot more to do, and our Minister's very keen to move in the direction of preventative spending. I think it's particularly important in the light of the current financial climate that we do so, because if we continue to spend just on the existing initiatives, then we never really get a chance to move towards preventative spend. For that reason, then, we're very pleased to see the proposal for a change fund of £30 million for 2015-16. And I think that will allow a ring-fenced budget to be focused on that type of initiative, and maybe some thought to be given to that. So the idea is that that fund will be used for issues which are innovative and cross-cutting or preventative. Now, it's not a huge amount of money, but it still will allow some thinking to go in that direction. So Public Sector Reform Division was set up just about a year ago, and we have a number of tools in our toolkit to be able to assist people in reform. And I think we have to be very aware of the climate, the financial climate, but I think one of the things we want to say is reform isn't only just about budgetary cuts. So preventative spend is very much one of the things we're looking at. We're working with a number of departments, and we're looking at mechanisms that will help us to live within the financial climate and to make the necessary changes. So we have things like the Innovation Lab, which we've done some work on, and I know you have a session. I won't go into much detail on it now, but because you have a session on it next week. But it allows us to look at problems in a different way and come out with maybe an outcomes-based solution, which the preventative spending is very much aligned with. We are looking at demand management. One of the other issues, as well as the budgetary constraints that we have to look at, is the increasing demand and increasing expectations of the public. So we're looking at, for example, alternative funding models, partnership working with the voluntary sector and other areas. Now, all of these things take a while to develop, but I think these kind of initiatives are going to help us to shape the public services of the future. The other emerging technologies obviously are going to help with that as well. So we're looking at all of that type of thing. The OECD review is just about to commence, as you know, and that will look at benchmarking Northern Ireland's public services against international comparators. And again, I won't go into more detail on that because you have a session specifically on that next week as well. We then have noted in your research paper that the preventative spend and you did define early intervention slightly differently, and I suppose we're looking at those in the whole in terms of the change fund. So you define preventative spend as targeting the full population to prevent something from happening, and early intervention as targeting it at people who have the early signs of something. But I think in the term preventative spending, what we're talking about is both of those combined. One of the other issues that arose in your research papers was the need to classify expenditure as preventative or otherwise. And I think the Minister's response, maybe if I expand a bit on that, is to say that whilst that isn't explicitly done, the Northern Ireland Guide to Expenditure and Appraisal really asks you to set out the reasons for doing something. So preventative spend should be included as one of the objectives, if it is one of the objectives. And I think to go backwards and classify things as preventative spend would be maybe counterproductive, because I think then that means everybody gets into a flurry to try and classify what they're doing as preventative. So we see it more as stating as an objective up front. You also mentioned the Invest to Save schemes of the past. And I think really you'd asked whether they had been monitored and appraised. For all projects, the departments who have received that money should be observing the guidance and doing post-project appraisals, lessons learned from those. The Change Fund, you had suggested that the criteria should be specifically tailored for the Change Fund and what we wanted to do, and that's what is planned at the moment. The Minister is going to be considering exactly how to take that forward. So that's a brief summary of where we are, and happy to answer any questions.
It's certainly an interesting area. In terms of preventative spending, would it be of benefit to have an overarching definition of what it is? Because every department obviously will have a definition to suit themselves and suit their objectives as they are now and have been for the past 5 years, for example. So would that be of benefit?
I think there will be something like that in the guidelines, but I think your research papers highlighted the difficulty with that. I mean, there's lots and lots of definitions of it, but the one in the most recent paper, I think, provided a fairly good definition. Now, it'll be a guideline, but when somebody's then applying for the fund or saying that their project needs to meet the criteria, I think if that was maybe a couple of lines to say this is the general direction of what preventative spend is, and then they explain exactly how it is a preventative spend, because even within the definition that you've provided, it's still very wide, because if you think preventative spend can be something to prevent something that's going to happen within this budget period, where you really would have the payback within the budget period, or it could be something that's an intervention now where you mightn't get the benefit for 10 years. So I think it's quite loose, but I think there would be benefit in some guidance.
Okay, just bring the members at this point. Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. I sort of welcome the £30 million set aside for this fund, but realistically, £30 million, what actually can you do with that there in the grand scheme of things?
Well, in the grand scheme of things, 30 million can seem like a small amount of money, but it's quite a large amount of money within 1 year. Mm-hmm. So I suppose there is potential then to see how that goes, and the executive could then consider whether they want to extend this kind of outcomes-based approach. It's really a move towards an outcomes-based approach as opposed to an inputs-based way of funding projects. But given the timescale for expenditure, it's quite tight to spend something in a year if you know when the draft budget is made into a final budget in, say, January time. And money's allocated then. It's quite an ask to spend something as big as that within a year. So I think whilst it's not huge, it has potential to make some difference.
And the outcome of that there, you know, seeing, looking, say this time next year we're sitting, are you back in here again, you know, and giving your outcomes, you know?
Yes.
What do you expect then, you know, really to be coming here to tell us?
I think each individual project will have to be measured against the objectives that it was set. But we may know something more next year. Will actually, projects that are within a 1 year time scale, we might be saying, I'm only surmising this, we might be saying 1 year isn't long enough to do this. We might be saying, well, actually, we've got 2 or 3 good projects out of it, and this type of project's good. So I think it's hard to tell at this stage till we see what comes in.
Yeah, that's fine, Chair. Thanks.
What's the criteria and timetable for assessing the effectiveness of the change fund?
For setting the criteria in the first place?
Yeah.
Well, those 3 overarching ones that I said are the ones that were in the budget paper. Over the next number of weeks, we will have to get the criteria against which people will apply, because the allocations have to be made in the final budget. Then the assessment of them, it'll depend. I mean, every project, according to the appraisal guidance, every project has to be assessed and a post-project evaluation done, depending on the size of the project after a certain time after completion. So I suppose it depends how long the project is. But I would imagine that for most of them, they won't be finished early in the year if we only get the allocation in January, February time. So I think it'll probably be year end really before they're up for appraisal.
And what evaluation has been done of the Invest to Save?
The Invest to Save, well, again, Peter, maybe do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been 3 Invest to Save schemes over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. In terms of the evaluation of that, all the individual projects that bid for those will have been evaluated after they've been completed at a certain point, maybe depending on the type of project, you know, but 1, 2, 3 years after. So it's at project level the evaluation would have happened on those schemes.
And how did that inform the change fund?
The change fund is really is a separate thing, as I see it, and I think Berning's, it's more about preventive spending, whereas the Invest to Save funds, they weren't really about preventive spending; it was about saving money. You know, it was a different type of fund.
In setting the criteria, we will of course be looking at all previous criteria to see how well they match. But I think it's really to focus on those 3 criteria: the innovative, cross-cutting, and preventative, and how we can best measure how a project will meet that. And whatever we've learned from previous schemes will inform that, but I think it's not directly related.
The committee had requested information on the Invest to Save initiative in early October. Any idea when that will be available to the committee?
I hope it will be with you soon. I know it's been pulled together as you speak. Will it be cleared and get to you very soon?
How soon?
I can't say.
It's getting very frustrating today. Before Christmas, or?
I would hope so, yeah.
So before Christmas. Okay. All right, John.
You're in a good run today, probably some of the criticism around Invest to Save might be that it was, you know, the earlier in the session we were looking at some that have been used, say, for redundancies and stuff. I mean, you're absolutely certain, at least when you move to the new, the change fund, that there will be that it will be going in very targeted places, you know, whether it's early years education or health preventative measures or things like that.
The criteria are being said to be innovative, cross-cutting, or preventative. And I think the early exit scheme is to be funded according to the budget by a different pot of money. But I suppose the change fund then is after that happens. So if you imagine that a number of people are no longer in the system, what transformation is required to make the public services work? Could be organisational change, it could be some sort of transformation of service, but yes, separate from that scheme.
Or separate from the change fund, so yes. It won't.
So the change fund is for change within the system, not for the exit scheme.
But again, how do we get to the bottom of will it end up at front line affecting change in people's lives, rather than, you know, when you come in here and say about preventive spend, I tend to think, and some of the presentations and the research that the committee has looked at is about, really upstreaming where you would intervene. Is that where this is really going to try and target?
Yes, well, I think, as I said earlier, it really ties in with the outcomes-based approach. So if you're looking, say the outcome is that you want a reduction in, I'll just use an example, an increase in literacy across the population, then the interventions can come earlier. So yes, it is to be targeted at the citizen. Exactly how that works will just have to be spelt out in the ground, but each project will have to explain what that preventative element is. Or, the fund is also to be used for innovative and cross-cutting matters as well. So if it could be used to help some sort of innovation, which could be a service innovation, which will affect citizens. But yes, the citizen has to be at the centre of the process, and whatever the money goes to should be aimed in that direction, whether it's an organisational change, whether it's a service delivery change or whatever.
Thanks, Chair. That's probably the bit for me that as I'd be keenest to watch on and see that it actually gets to the end, or it's changing lives.
Paul, thank you very much. I sometimes see a lot of these as changing of titles. Preventive expand, invest to save, and the change fund and all of these issues. Just a matter of changing just of titles as opposed to they're all trying to do the very same thing, which is save money and ensure that we get good delivery for money. And I appreciate that we still have a silo mentality. We have a cultural change that needs to take place, and I'm thinking of organisations such as PEDU, groups that were set up such as PEDU, and the lack of engagement even within departments to try and embrace that process to save money. I appreciate that it also is a preventative expenditure, because it should be, but unfortunately it's not, because we find that departments have not got rid of any of the staff that would have been doing that function within their department. Whether they, I don't know, it hasn't been noted from me that there is any change, and there's some reluctance among those areas to actually engage in this process. So from a preventative spend, and I'll maybe just give you an example of what I see as preventative spend, and some people might have a different impression of it, and clarify whether I've got this right, because this actually maybe deals with AMI funding as well. Somebody who is waiting on an operation, while they're waiting on that operation, they're receiving benefits because they cannot get to work.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, they are a burden upon AMI funding. But because that's not part of our budget, we don't really care. That seems to be the attitude. Yet that person is not contributing because they're not necessarily working and paying taxes, and their employer has either had to let them go. They're not necessarily civil servants. Talking about maybe wider public. I'm just wondering how broad this whole process will be.
I think, you raised a number of issues there. The old PEDU unit is now, it's still within Public Sector Reform Division. It's Economic Advisory Unit, which is an advisory service, but I think the thrust is very much on departments working together. And
I appreciate the thrust might well be, but I still think the silo mentality exists and is alive and well.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's one of the reasons why the other criterion within the Change Fund is cross-cutting. I think you're right to say that there are many examples of funds where people have tried to take a bit out to stop just addressing the immediate acute problems. And the Invest to Save was probably a more money-focused one. As Peter said, it was to save money. And that's why the Change Fund, the criteria will be different, because it does mean that we have to have cross-departmental, cross-boundary working, as well as the transformation. So it's, whilst the money available in the system as a whole is reducing, we still do need to change the way we do things. So I would hope that projects that meet the kind of criteria that you're talking about there, where it encourages people to think about the impact in other departments, other bodies as well, would then score highly on those criteria. That's what's planned. But as you say, it's very difficult to get something that meets exactly what you want it to do.
I'm just wondering how wide the engagement is going to be within departments. and what the buy-in is going to be to ensure that we, instead of looking at a small, we see the big picture. And I know these are maybe buzz things, but I genuinely think a lot of people are only looking at very small portions of the picture. They don't see the big picture of what we're trying to achieve.
Well, if this fund is focused on people working together and we get some success with that, as Adrian said earlier, then maybe it could be a model that's rolled out more widely. It could be used to see what actually are the obstacles to doing that kind of working. Until we see what kind of projects come forward, I think it's going to be hard to tell whether they are as cross-cutting as you would hope they would be. But I would expect that, I mean, people across all public bodies are faced by financial constraints and they're faced by increased demand. So they have to do something.
I don't necessarily. I agree, yes, they're faced with financial constraints, but I see a certain amount of protectionism going on, which is where I have a difficulty. You know, doesn't necessarily mean the public get any better service, but there's protectionism going on in a whole network that's going on there, and that's where I see if they're out to actually frustrate the process, they can, and they do, and they can not adopt change, and by not adopting change or being willing to change, they can make this look like it's not necessarily going to be anything. It'll eventually come forward and say, fortunately, that didn't work. We've tried it, but it wasn't necessarily the right route to go down. Unless we get proper engagement and buy-in, it's not going to happen.
Well, if all the executive members agree to this fund and agree that their arm's length bodies and their departments are going to participate in it, at least it should go into the melting pot for consideration at the start.
I've absolutely no problem with it being in the melting pot. But I think there's a cultural change that needs to take place. We're great at trying to protect culture in this, but I think there's a cultural change within a public sector bodies that need to be
well, I mentioned the Innovation Lab earlier. I mean, one of the issues that we're looking at in the Innovation Lab is culture and innovative culture in the civil service, as to how we can encourage that. So I think the problem is recognised that maybe our systems and processes don't make it easy to innovate, and how can we change that? So I think it's one of the areas we're looking at, an interesting area.
Thank you.
I noticed from the research paper there isn't a lot of studies done within Northern Ireland on how well, for example, early intervention and Invest to Save have actually achieved what the outcomes have been. But I do remember that in our debates here about early years education, the Early Years organisation brought an economist from America who had studied the impact of investment in early years education. And not only did it save money, but it also prevented the people who were involved in it from becoming involved with the law, the courts, prisons later on in life. And probably they were the more important outcomes. Have you had a look at any international research around these type of initiatives and how they might better inform us here on how to implement them?
In terms of the international research, well, obviously we've read your papers, but we have done some scoping of international reform initiatives across the board. The Innovation Lab, for example, came out of international research. We have developed a number of themes to look at as part of the OECD review. And there are 3 overarching themes with 9 sub-themes, but one of those sub-themes is preventative spending. And that's what we're asking the OECD to benchmark us internationally against that. So we will hope to get some recommendations from that. We've also done some research as well ourselves on the basis of that, just to look at the various types of approaches we might take to preventative spend. And that has helped us to inform our thinking on what the criteria might look like. But I think there's a lot more to do in that field. The Carnegie work, the Carnegie Roundtable, looking at wellbeing outcomes and various outcome measures, is just coming to fruition at the moment. And it's looking at very much along the lines of what the Scottish Government did, and the very types of issues that you've mentioned have been highlighted in that, where a very early intervention or a preventative thing does have a big impact downstream, where a small amount of money now saves a lot of money, and we're looking at how that can be fed into it. So things like our business case process, our approval process, how do those all impact on the way people think? And it's a bit of like what Paul mentioned earlier. Our system doesn't encourage us to look long term because of our short term budgetary outlook. So we're reviewing how it looks on an international basis. But again, it's not an easy problem to solve because of the system that we have.
Okay. I noticed there last week the figures on children waiting a diagnosis for autism were something like 1,800 throughout Northern Ireland. And I mean, one of the constant themes in respect of autism is early diagnosis and early intervention. So, you know, it's almost like a mantra, and we keep repeating it, but we don't seem to do it very effectively. Perhaps, hopefully, this initiative will encourage some departments to do that. Martin.
Dr. Stewart, thank you. And I want to echo what Paul Gervin said, and that really preventative spending for many of us, I think many of the ministers would argue almost all their spending is preventative. And the example I have that probably won't get into this fund is that on the 16th of October, standing with families whose homes flooded again, the Minister for the Department of Environment kindly issues an emergency relief grant of £1,000, but it would cost a small amount of money actually to fix the problem, which is a drain, a collapsed culvert behind homes in South Belfast, one of the areas. So that would be preventative funding. We'd be focused on the citizen, because it's not easy to raise a family when your home floods with foul water and rainwater every 2 years. But that said, I think what I want you to help me with is take me through the timeline of this £30 million for the Change Fund. When will it be triggered? When will people be able to apply? You talked then about the criteria: cross-cutting, innovative, creative, and so on, interdepartmental. When would that be assessed? I take it this summer will intervene in some of this. When do you expect monies to be paid? And I suppose then when will those monies be spent?
The money is for the year 15-16.
Okay.
And the budget paper actually specifies that the applications will be before the final budget is agreed, so it's a very short time scale. So I'm talking about the next number of weeks to get the criteria agreed, with a call for bids to be assessed before the final budget is agreed, with people then knowing they're getting the money at the time of the final budget. Expenditure has to take place, very tight time scale, within the year. Schemes will really need to be able to spend pretty much up front.
And you see these as schemes or projects? I mean, are these
schemes, projects, initiatives? I'm using the word scheme as in the broader sense.
Yes, I understand, yeah.
But yes, I mean, what you've described is a preventative project, and it is citizen focused, and John has mentioned there earlier that it's important to focus on the citizen. So I think it's important for people in departments and in various bodies to be thinking, what kind of things could we spend this on now that are innovative, cross-cutting or preventative, because the time scale for return will be very short. And I recognise that this is not the panacea for all ills, but it is a start in terms of funding that kind of thinking, because as you've all mentioned, it's a cultural change to think about prevention longer term rather than in the short term budget period.
Okay, I share your confidence in the ability of our departments to bid, to obtain and to spend before the 31st of March 2016.
It's a challenge, no doubt about it.
Okay, Michaela.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. I suppose, a you can't answer this, I understand. But I suppose there's been a lot of discussion and debate going on quite recently here and across the water with the Rotherham case, and indeed our own sexual exploitation issues here that we have for our own vulnerable young people and children. We talk about invest to save to have better long-term outcomes, and we do talk about citizen focus. I'm asking the question, and I mean, coming out of a lot of those issues, I think something that was very much to the mind and the fore of people were the lack of leadership shown right across all of the agencies and people involved with or should have been involved in the protection of young children and young people who were sexually exploited. But what are the departments doing collectively in relation to address that here? And is there schemes or programmes included in the innovation labs around for those individuals who have been affected, and indeed families? And I know there's a lot of family intervention programmes going on, but is that specific issue being addressed in terms of invest to save?
Well, the invest to save schemes are now closed, so the Change Fund is just about to start. In terms of the Innovation Lab, the way that works, and you'll get a fuller presentation next week, it's really a facilitation of solving a problem that some department or public body brings to us, and the way it works is there's a piece of research up front and you get some experts in and you come forward with a number of recommendations. So that issue, that specific issue about the Rotherham, the outcome from that, would need to be brought to the group particularly to look at. Again, we see ourselves as having a toolkit to assist people. In terms of the leadership issue and the cultural issue, like the one I had mentioned earlier about the culture, leadership is one of the issues that has been looked at across the public sector. There are various initiatives in leadership for public leaders, but I think that's slightly separate from what you're asking me. But there are initiatives to look at leadership, but a specific issue such as that has not been brought to our lab particularly at this stage. But that doesn't mean that there may be work going on that I don't know about.
Okay, any further questions? Thank you very much, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you, John.
Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We move on to item 7 on the agenda, which is draft budget 15-16 public service pensions provisions. We have a briefing from EFP, and I'd like to welcome. Yeah, right. It's Grace Nesbitt, Head of Pensions Division, Blanard Smith, Policy and Legislation, and I'd like to welcome Grace and Blanard, give them a chance to sit down first of all. And would you like to make an opening statement, Blanard or Grace?
There's a number of matters before the committee this morning, so I thought I would just go through things in sequence and deal with each in turn. Is that okay? Is that acceptable? Sorry, I missed your opening
We'll start off with, we'll deal first of all with the pension provisions.
In the budget, yes, so I'll just run through in the order that's been set out in the agenda.
Yeah.
There's not an awful lot that I can provide to the committee this afternoon by way of detail on that matter. There is a provision, as you'll have seen, in the draft executive budget which has been published and which is out for consultation. That consultation is due to end, I understand, on the 29th of December, and then there will be a paper going to the executive in January. In terms of what the level of employer contributions will be, that's still very much a work in progress across the schemes. In some regards, it's a matter for each sector to obviously brief their committee, and their minister will be responsible for it. And work is underway with the Government Actuaries Department on a scheme-by-scheme basis to look at the valuations. What I can undertake the committee is to provide an update on this matter in due course, and when we finalise the directions for the valuations, which again are still a work in progress at this point in time.
Okay. When was the risk first identified?
I suppose that the risk began to emerge. I'm not in a position to give the committee an exact date, but really I would say over the last few months, as work on valuations has been progressing on each schemes.
Okay. I mean, during 2013, when we were scrutinising the public sector pensions bill, there was no word of this potential increase. Why has it emerged suddenly over the last 2 or 3 months?
There's a couple of separate pieces of work happening at the same time, so it is a little bit confusing, but they're not linked. First of all, the main matter that I've been updating this committee on over the last matter of months and potentially years is about the reform of public service pensions. So that's one piece of work that's been progressing. This issue about the level of employer contributions is emerging from the result of scheme valuations, which are being undertaken at this point in time. So the two are actually entirely separate.
Yeah. I think on the 5th of November, we had a briefing on the budget paper then. Other officials stated that the employer contributions had been understated over a number of years. Would you agree with that?
I'm not really in a position to comment on that at this point in time. I mean, I think there's a number of reasons, and it is, evaluation of a scheme is quite a complex and intricate piece of work. So there are a number of variables at play there, and we have, different changes in terms of population shift, in terms of people leaving pension schemes, ill health retirements. They're just a multiple number of factors which affect the outcome of evaluation and in turn impact on the level of employer contributions. So there's not a simple answer to say they were too low before and should have been higher. It's just not as simple a matter as that.
And it's on a scheme-by-scheme basis as well. Each scheme will have different outcomes and experience.
Okay. Well, during that briefing, I think the figure that we were given, which had come apparently from the government actuary department, was 200 million. And you're now saying it's around 133 million. That's quite a difference. So how can we rely on the figures that we get if there's such a disparity between them?
I'm not sure about the figure of the 200 million, where that arose from. I don't.
GAD, the government actuary department, apparently supplied that.
And was that a figure about the level of employer contributions? Because there's been a number of figures supplied by the government actuaries department.
As far as I know, yes, it related to employer contributions.
I can't comment because I haven't been privy to that figure. Previous figures that I've provided this committee with from the Government Actuaries Department have been about the cost of delay in implementing pension reform, and that's estimated to be over 300 million. So I can't comment on the 200 million. The provision that's been in the draft budget is 133.2 million, which the Minister made clear in the Assembly when he introduced the draft budget, and also it is obviously in the published document as well.
Was the department completely and utterly unprepared for this?
I think it's fair to say that the outcome of the valuations wasn't known, so we weren't.
Wasn't known.
Was not known. Well, it couldn't have been known because the valuations hadn't been done. So, in a way, it was a blank canvas as to what the level of employer contributions would be. So we actually didn't know whether they were going to go up, whether they were going to stay the same, or indeed whether they were going to go down. And there would have been no way of anticipating that before the valuations actually started to go underway to go through the detail of each scheme.
Would it not have been prudent for Finance Department to take some steps to preparatory steps in the event of the contributions increasing as they have done.
But they would have no way of knowing that they were going to increase, likewise an outcome of the valuations.
But they would know the possibility of it.
Well, there was also the possibility that they could have decreased or could have stayed the same, so it really was an unknown quantity until the valuations actually work and get underway. And they are very detailed pieces of work. I can't emphasise that enough, which are undertaken.
I'm not doubting that.
I know, but there's, I mean, just to be absolutely clear, there's no way anybody could have known.
Yes, I take the point, but you know, there was a possibility, and 133 million is quite a hefty impact in one particular year.
I mean, I agree that it is, but all I can do is reiterate what I've said. The outcome could have been entirely different. They could have stayed the same, and likewise they could have went down. So because the outcomes were right along that continuum, from no change, decreasing, increasing, I think it would have been difficult, to be fair to finance colleagues, that they could have made any provision or estimate about that.
Okay. Mr. Weir.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if we invest to see if might be getting sort of grace some tarot cards perhaps in the future, because it seemed to be that it's one thing, I suppose, to be fair, when you get a situation that you have an idea of a sort of a ballpark and making into great preparation of, well, we feel it might be 110 or it might be 130 or it might be 150, but when we're not in a position to know whether the thing will go up, down, or at what level on that side of it. I suppose, Grace, I appreciate what you're saying in terms of the exact figure is going to be a degree of work in progress.
Yes.
So there's, you know, we're still sort of sealing, okay, there's been a figure put in the draft budget, but in terms of the way the schemes operate, there's still a degree of finessing to do that. And that's clearly going to form part of the budgetary. But so maybe this is an unfair question. In terms of looking ahead then, obviously assuming this will obviously lead to a long-term, you know, baseline increase in terms of that from a government spend point of view. But is there any other projections done or thinking around what the likely trend is going to be in terms of future increases along the lines of, are we expecting this to be like as a one-off leap and then no real particular bit, or are we expecting then that it is likely then to lead to a certain, beyond the addition that's been put into the baseline, on a, you know, additional cost year on year, sort of on top of what's there? What are we seeing as the potential sort of trend over the next, say, 2 or 3 years?
Well, I think these valuations will set the level of employer contributions for another 3 to 4 years.
Yes.
So obviously that the quantum that the employer pays will be dependent on the pensionable pay of the workforce. So first point I would make is, if there's changes in the makeup of a workforce or the pensionable pay of the workforce, that will obviously impact on the level of employer contributions. So that's the first point I would make. The second point is, there will be another raft of valuations starting in 2018-2019, and they again will be looking at the same process will be gone through again. It's very hard to predict actually what the outcome of future valuations will be. What I would say is, one of the areas that we are working on is to produce valuation directions. It's one of the responsibilities that's been given to the Department of Finance and Personnel as part of the reform of public service pensions, and the intention behind that is to have valuations carried out on a robust and a regular basis, so that the costs are better managed between the employer, i.e. the taxpayer, and the members of the scheme, and there will be cost control measures put in there to manage that better.
In one sense, at least above an external change, we're looking at maybe some level of change to the landscape, probably from 2018 onwards, potentially.
Yes.
Whether that'd be good, bad, or indifferent in that regard.
Yeah.
But beyond that, in terms of the rest is largely between then and now controllable in amongst ourselves. So if anything, I suppose the one aspect, while there may be issues around sort of uplift of pay or whatever that might have some level of impact, depending upon how deep or how radical, for example, a voluntary exit scheme would go, because obviously the level of pension, employer pension contribution will be more or less largely dependent upon what the overall shall we say, wage bill within the public sector is. If there was a situation in which there was a reduction in the number of public servants, and therefore on that bill, that will have a degree of corresponding impact on the pension contribution side of it then?
Yes. I mean, if you're employing less people, you've less employer pensions contributions to pay. The valuations, just to be clear, I'll just check my colleague, they actually start in 2016, is that right? It's 3 years.
Yeah.
3 years, but the outcome would impact on 17-18.
So we would have an
Yes.
idea, if you like,
Yes.
at that stage,
Yes.
on it, but the pure impact will be probably 3 years down the line before any external adjustments
Yes,
go aside.
these are 2012 valuations that are ongoing at the moment, and they'll set the rate for 15 to 19.
Yeah, so it's quite a long. So the start of evaluation process, just to make that clear, it's quite a long process. It takes a year, a couple of years to actually do evaluation.
And then we will have a cost cap mechanism in place. There'll be regulations coming out of the directions that set a cost cap for schemes going forward. So.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Leslie?
Thanks, Chair. I was just wondering, would we not have been better staying with the old pension scheme?
No.
Are you sure about that?
I'm 100% positive about that. In terms of the old, i.e. the current pension scheme, in terms of those people who don't have a lot of mobility throughout their career in terms of progressing up the grades, it's unfair. So in terms of what generally are lower paid workers, they are disadvantaged by a final salary pension scheme. So there's a real fairness and inequality issue with our current pension arrangements. And secondly, in terms of costs, I'm passionate about maintaining and sustaining public service pensions. We would not have been able to do that with the old pension scheme. And indeed, I think the costs that we're now facing in terms of employer contributions would have been even greater had we not have been introducing the reforms which are scheduled for 2015, which again the evaluation process will have taken account of by the Government Actuary.
I never thought a career, the actual valuing, the career average would have been a lot cheaper than the final salary.
It will be, which is why it's good to move towards that. But we're only starting to move towards that, and some people, like myself, will remain in final salary for another 10 years.
You declaring an interest here in it?
I have already declared an interest to the committee, and I am proud to say I'm a member of the Civil Service Pension Scheme, and I'm in Classic. Thank you for reminding me, Mr. Girvan. So yes, I have quite frequently said I'm a member of the scheme, but no, I'm fully supportive and actually quite passionate about the reforms. We would be in a much worse position had we not been introducing these reforms.
Two quick points, Grace. The 133, listening to your reply to Peter, is it recurrent at 133?
Yes.
Every year it'll be now until it's revalued?
Pardon? Well, it's
133 until the next revaluation?
Yes. The figure of the 133 provision, which is a provision, as an estimate, we're just working on that figure. That's about the increase in the level of employer contributions. So that figure will be carried forward.
What about the employee contributions?
The employee contributions have been set, and we've already given an update to the committee on those are set by a scheme basis, and those
they're not going to increase then.
They're not. They have increased under the 3-year programme of employee contributions increases, and also when the new schemes are introduced in 2015. There's already been consultation on that, and those figures have been published. And employee contributions will also be increasing in 2015.
What are the percentages?
Pardon?
What are the percentages?
For which?
Employee or an employee?
I can provide that to the committee. I just couldn't.
Yes,
they differ. They differ by each scheme, both the employee and the individual.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Leslie. I have to declare an interest as well, Grace, because I'm a member of the teachers' scheme.
Okay.
Working all right on it?
I haven't declared the interest before, like Grace. Grace, can I ask you about the employer's cost cap?
Yes.
It comes into effect in April 2015.
Yes.
If that's the case, then why do we have? Are we faced with such a huge cost to the public purse?
The employer's cost cap will come into effect. We're hoping to lay the regulations on that shortly. It comes into effect in 2018, in that it's on the statute.
2015?
Or 2015, sorry, my apologies. But in terms of actually it, in effect, is maybe a little bit misleading. It will be on the statute, but in terms of it actually having an impact, the impact and the power, if you like, in those regulations will actually be applied at the next value in terms of the outcome of the next valuation when we know what the outcome is going to be. So we're putting in a provision now which will actually be coming to be effective, is the best way I can describe it, at the next valuations.
Right. And what's the period the evaluation period?
Well, it's 4 years for most
4
schemes,
years.
3 years, I think, for local government.
Will it not come into 2019 then?
Well, the rates will change in 2019.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Any other questions? Michaela?
Just briefly, Grace and Bernard, thanks. Are the unions happy? On what aspect? I'm just noting a letter in our packs from the chairperson of NIPSA.
All right, Michaela, I think that applies to the next item.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, beg your pardon.
They're unhappy with a completely different subject.
But they're happy about the next item.
Well, that's good. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, that got a bit confusing. Was that? Okay.
Thank you very much for your evidence today, and we will be in touch with you as is necessary. But
Okay.
you're remaining on, of course, for
Right,
the
I
next
was getting
item.
confused there.
My question.
I thought you were asking me to leave.
That was in reference to the pensions issue. Yeah, we're moving on now to item number 8, which is a legislative consent motion, partial and transfers out of unfunded public service defined benefit schemes to defined contribution pension schemes.
Okay.
So, Grace or Blanard, would you like to speak to that,
Okay, my
please?
colleague Blanard's just going to give a short overview, and then we'll certainly come back to your question.
Okay. The committee will be aware, both from correspondence and at our last meeting on the 5th of November, that Minister will be seeking an LCM for the Westminster Pension Schemes Bill to make provision to ban transfers from unfunded defined benefit public service pension schemes to defined contribution schemes. At our last meeting on the 5th of November, the committee was advised that there would be further issues within the Pension Schemes Bill which Treasury may be seeking to incorporate within this LCM. And if the committee permits, I'm now in a position to provide some further information on that. As the committee will know, the transfer ban relates only to unfunded public service pension schemes. It does not extend to funded schemes. Following responses to the consultation on freedom and choice in pensions, consideration has now been given to the impact of a high volume of transfers from funded schemes to defined contribution schemes, following the introduction of the flexibilities from April 15. Although funded schemes have a fund from which liabilities can be drawn, there's a real possibility of a significant increase in the transfer traffic, and as a result, this would be as a result of the introduction of the flexibilities. So as a further safeguard measure to protect the public purse, HM Treasury are proposing to introduce a further amendment to the Pension Schemes Bill, which will provide powers to switch on an ability to reduce the value of a cash equivalent transfer in certain circumstances. This would only be in the event of either as a direct result of increased transfer volumes or a combination of other factors. There's an increased risk of taxpayer intervention to support the funded scheme, or a risk that the necessary intervention is significantly greater than it would otherwise have been. That's because there's a government guarantee to the funded scheme. And as you know, we have one funded scheme here, the local government scheme. As this policy falls within the remit of the freedom and choice in pensions, it is the Department's view that a separate LCM for this aspect is not required. Obviously, the Department accepts that the Assembly could legislate independently to introduce the provisions. However, given the availability of time before the new flexibilities will be introduced, the Department is minded that the LCM is the most appropriate legislative route to implement the safeguards, which are limited in effect and will do so purely as a measure to prevent public service pension scheme members and taxpayers here from being financially exposed. Treasury anticipate that they will lay their relevant clauses in Westminster today, and we will share those when we have the final clauses through today. We have written to our Minister to update him on this latest CETV. This is the cash equivalent transfer value issue. So hopefully there will be an update coming out from that as well.
Okay. Just a point that Michaela raised there earlier on, but ICTU, Congress of Trade Unions. The point that they raise is why this is not being applied to all public sector schemes.
Well, it's applied to all unfunded public sector schemes. It's not applied to funded schemes because they operate on a different basis, so they're entirely different from unfunded schemes. That's the rationale behind it.
It's because they have a fund. They have a fund. The CETV, that transfer value, there is actually a fund where this can be transferred from, where there isn't with an unfunded scheme. And that's why this additional safeguard has been brought about, because should there be a run on the scheme, then they can actually reduce this value, which would make it less attractive for people to want to actually transfer their money out. So this can be switched on. It would be a ministerial decision, and they can switch on this reduced value and then switch it off again if it's found that it's not actually required any longer.
Okay. What's the up-to-date timetable or time frame? When do you envisage the memorandum being led and the committee's 15-day period commencing?
Yeah, well, the committee's 15 days would commence at the laying of the memorandum, and as I said there, Treasury have advised that they hope to lay their clauses today. So if that is the case, we'll be in a position to lay the memorandum within the next day or so.
The next day or so?
Yeah, we have the memorandum prepared. We're just waiting for the final clauses to incorporate that.
When you prepared before?
Oh, yeah, always prepared.
Okay. Any further questions there?
Do you have it? No, I got the clarity on the unfunded scheme. Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move on then to item number 9, which is a legislative consent motion, Small Business, Enterprise and Environment Bill, Recovery of Public Sector Redundancy Pay. And I'll ask, is it Grace or Blana?
Yes.
Grace,
Yeah,
thank you.
It's a Small Business, Enterprise and Employment Bill. This bill was introduced in Westminster in the House of Commons in June 2014. The bill contains provisions on a range of financial policies. Specifically, it also contains measures to enable the recovery of what is termed exit payments when an individual earning more than 100,000 returns to the same part of the public sector shortly after their exit. It's proposed that those who rejoin the public sector employment within a month will repay the whole of that repayment. That payment. Those who rejoin after a month but less than a year will be required to pay less proportion to the time they have spent outside public sector employment. And the measures are scheduled to have effect from the 1st of April 2015. The principal intent of the bill is to safeguard public finances and ensure that public service funds are not diverted to compensate high-earning individuals for loss of office in cases where that loss is transitory due to the individual re-entering paid employment within the sector. Treasury has proposed that a single set of redundancy arrangements should apply to the whole of the United Kingdom, as this would be good in terms of avoiding barriers to labour mobility. Our Minister received a formal request for a legislative consent motion on this matter at the start of last month. The Minister wrote to ministerial colleagues on the 12th of November to seek their agreement to lay a memorandum, and it's anticipated that the legislative consent motion will be discussed at the next meeting of the Executive. That is hopefully tomorrow. And I also note that the committee should have in your papers a written update from Departmental Assembly section on the 12th of November. It would be within the scope of the Assembly, of course, to legislate for this provision in its own bill. However, that legislation just simply would not receive royal assent by the 1st of April. So given the timescales involved, it's the Department's view that the use of legislative consent mechanism will ensure that high-earning public servants in the devolved administration are not treated more favourably than their counterparts in the rest of the United Kingdom in this regard. It will also ensure that the same protections for the public purse are seen to be applied consistently at this time when I think we all recognise public funding is rather stretched. I'm happy to take any questions.
Can I ask you, Grace, why is the threshold set at 100,000? I mean, why not 90,000, 80,000?
I'm not sure of the thinking behind that. I think it's felt that 100,000 is a reasonable figure to set it at. So I'm not sure of the workings that went in to determine that level of 100,000.
Some people might think 90,000 is reasonable, or 80,000.
Some people might think 30 or 40,000 was reasonable in these difficult times.
Okay. You said there, your paper says that contains measures to facilitate effective recovery and compensation payments from individuals who exit a role in the public sector and then return to the same part of the public sector in a short space of time.
Yeah.
Why would it be confined to the same part if they were public sector employees?
I think it's trying to get the balance. And obviously you want to give people some flexibility. So if somebody was a teacher and a high earning teacher of over £100,000,
Yes.
we may not have many of those, but maybe a head teacher. I'm not privy to the salary scales.
Myself now,
Well, I couldn't possibly comment on that now. But I think the thinking is that you want to give people some sort of choice in where they're going, and if they wanted to go somewhere else, that would be acceptable. So it may be that that's something which is reviewed in the fullness of time, and it's deemed to be any part of the public sector.
Well, I mean, if the principle behind it is, you said to save the public purse money, presumably, that if they were employed then by some other part of the public service, that savings wouldn't necessarily be made.
No, but again, I think it's a balance between how restrictive you want the practice to be and how rigorous you want it to be, and that's the balance which, rightly or wrongly, has been struck. But I agree, you could if you wished, make it more radical.
It just occurs to me that, it would probably benefit from being a little more rigorous, but in any case...
I think Mr Bradley, it's actually based on the experience in Great Britain and the health authorities, where a considerable number of people who were made redundant out of health authorities just moved to another authority straight afterwards, because they have so many in Great Britain. So there was a great percentage of people re-employed within a short period of time. We wouldn't really have so much experience of that in Northern Ireland.
Okay. So we mentioned the same part, but what about, how do you define a short space of time? How long is a short space of time?
In terms of the recovery of the money, I'd set out that in terms of...
you say, and then return to the same part of the public service in a short space of time.
Right.
How long or how short?
There would be guidance provided in that. I think there would be guidance provided in that. I think it's sort of within 6 months, but there could be a tapering effect, for time period.
So in the paper you say as well that the recovery position will not apply to redundancy payments where members of public service pensions who have an established unconditional right to full unreduced employer funded early retirement pensions in the case of redundancy.
Yeah.
It won't apply to that. So in that case, what is the what will that mean in practice, and what's the rationale for exclusion then?
I think it's felt that those are things which people are contractually entitled to. I suspect, as Blannett's helpfully reminded us, that in the health sector there may have been extremely generous. I'm not talking about health sector in Northern Ireland, I would add. Health sector in GB, there may have been very generous packages provided over and above what a particular compensation scheme for that sector provided. So again, it goes back to the prior point I made about just striking a balance between what people are entitled to, what they may get, and the overall cost of the public purse in that. But this is an area where there will absolutely have to be more detailed guidance on.
Well, in the past here, we've seen highly paid public servants retire and then being invited back by another department as a sort of an independent person to adjudicate on an inquiry or whatever, and that's quite useful because they do have the knowledge of government and they do have the skills required, and perhaps they may be able to look at a different department in a more objective way. Well,
that type of consultancy role, let's call it, will that be shut down?
No, because that's about people who have retired. This issue, this matter before the committee today is not about people that have retired, it's about redundancy payments.
Right, okay. Any other questions on this, Paul?
It's just on the point of the figure of 100,000, and appreciate it might not necessarily be that many that actually meet that criteria, and I don't know how they come up with the rationale for that, because I do believe that there is many who take advantage of, and I'm thinking of it from the schools aspect within Northern Ireland. I'll just use that as an example, where principals of schools were getting maybe 80 to 90,000 pounds salary, just falling short of maybe. But there's many that are getting over the 100,000, I might say, that are principals. But
you're looking at me, Paul.
No, I appreciate that, but I'm just. But where I am coming from is that some of them have, through the school's rationalisation programme, ended up taking redundancy, getting a fairly lucrative package, and going back into teaching.
Supply teachers.
Yes, as supply teachers, and probably working every bit as much as they did whenever they were per day. For a higher amount of money per day because they're on call. So I'm wondering, where do you actually? I don't know how you come up with this figure of 100,000. I think it doesn't necessarily address the issue that I would to come up with.
It may not, because I'm conscious that earning patterns are very different in Northern Ireland. But I think there's 2 points I would say to the committee. In terms of getting something in place quickly, the best way that we can at least do something is to use a legislative consent motion at this point in time. I mean, if there is a requirement and if there is a desire to actually look at the particular workings of that, and should we do something different in Northern Ireland, then I'm sure that's something which could be considered, either to pick up on your point about people moving between different sectors, that's too generous, and also your point, Mr. Girvan, about the quantum being set at 100,000. But I think at this point in time, for us to try and do something differently would take a significant amount of time to get a piece of legislation through our Assembly in that regard. So I think I would recommend doing the legislative consent motion at this time, and if there's felt that there is a need to revisit that, then it could be looked at again.
Well, I'll maybe use an example which some people maybe don't. I'll say it anyway. Local government within Northern Ireland had an exit scheme for councillors who wished to leave council, and as a consequence of leaving council, they would receive, and it's a modest amount of money for the time and the years that they were there. They had to 12 years before they qualified to get anything. So after they left, after 12 years, they would receive a small amount for every year, £600 for some of the years, and added up. But there's an upper limit. If they ever wanted to run again for council, they had to pay back the total amount that they received. Now, that's what happened within local government. And those of us who maybe gave more than our 12 years to local government, but we happen to be here, received nothing. But that's a fight for another day. But I'm saying there is an unfairness within the way there is an unfairness where councillors who receive a smaller amount of money, but people who are getting 100,000, and you could have somebody who's 90,000 who can do whatever they want and receive all of their money and not pay anything back. Because they're £10,000 short. So I appreciate go through the legislative consent process, but I still think that we should be looking at this ourselves at a later date.
It may well be something to look at, and I'm certainly, from my own personal experience within my own family, I know of the issues of supply teachers, and I think that's been talked about quite a bit in the media over many years, and this issue is not going to solve that. So I think there's a number of sectors which maybe require closer scrutiny at a point in time, and those things may be helpful to look at those, both in terms of the levels and in terms of what it actually means to work in another part of the public service.
I'm just overcome with sympathy for Paul here, but I'll try and go forward in any case. The points that Paul has made there in relation to the councillors, and he made one in relation to school principals. I'm not aware of any school principals who went back to the chalk face after retiring. But anyway, Yeah,
We're on that.
you know, are we not talking about a situation here where we need our own legislation? I mean, you've said quite clearly that this LCM is based on the experience regarding English health authorities, which is not really relevant here. So why are we doing it?
They would like to have a UK effect to this because there could be people transferring between the UK, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and likewise with the other devolved nations.
So if we didn't have at least the same provision here, and I do accept the points that members have made.
But is this LCM not going to restrict us, considering that there may be other areas in Northern Ireland that we do want to exert some control over?
I don't see it as being restrictive. This could be seen as a first step. If we don't do this, then we have the risk that if somebody gets a large package in England in a particular health authority, that they could come and work here, and the reclaiming bit would not apply. So I think this should be maybe best described and best seen as at least a first step, and consistency at this level. And if the devolved administration in Northern Ireland decides it's something more radical, and if in terms of the perspective of the individual, more severe is required, then I think there's absolutely no issue that could be looked at.
Okay, and would it be the department's view that we'll wait to see how this turns out and then review the situation, or have you discussed that?
I think my personal view at the minute is I would just like to get pension reform done and sorted and through, so there needs to be a wee bit of a reality check about just what the capacity is that we're actually able to do.
From the point of view of legislation?
Yes, well we think the biggest challenge we have facing us in terms of
I'm not talking about doing it immediately. Right. What I'm saying is if the LCM is led and passes through the Assembly, yes, would you be at some future date reviewing how effective it is, yes, and deciding whether or not there's a need for fresh legislation here?
Well, I think there would have to be to see did the legislation do what it was intended to do? Was the level, just the very helpful points that members have made, was the level appropriate? And the issue about transferring to different parts of the public sector, just was that a good idea? Was that a bad idea? So I think all those, the detail of that change would have to be looked at and evaluated and reviewed in terms of normal business.
Okay. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks, Chair. Just Grace, you sort of answered my question. I was going to ask you, if somebody was transferring from England to here,
yes,
before, if we didn't adopt this piece of legislation, what way it work, but they could do that there and still keep their big redundancy pay.
Yes, that's my understanding. That's why.
Well, has there been any cases that you know of recently that has done that? Maybe not transferred from England, but retired here with or made redundant here with a big package, and then come back to work in some more part of the.
But at the minute that could happen anyway.
That's what I'm saying, but has there been any cases
I've no information on that. I've no information, I've no detail on that.
That's okay.
Okay, can I ask you, thank you, Adrian, can I ask you how the department will ensure that the measures contained in the LCM are actually implemented? How will you police it, in other words?
Again, I think that's where there will be detailed guidance produced on that to inform employers, and also guidance in terms of public sector pension scheme.
Will the guidance come with the laying of the LCM or post?
I think it will be posted.
Right, okay. Can I ask you
sorry, my apologies for interrupting you, because it will be effective in April 15, so we have a little bit of time to get this
prepare the guidance. Yeah. So can I ask you, when the memorandum will be laid in the Assembly here?
I think that's dependent on if one of it is considered at the executive meeting tomorrow, and also if it's agreed at the executive meeting tomorrow. But I would like to think fairly soon after that.
Okay. Any further questions from anyone? No? Okay, we'll move on to item number 10. Before we do that, can I seek agreement to write to the applicable trade union, which is First Division, for comment on the proposed LCM in the meantime? Reid? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item number 10, which is subordinate legislation in relation to public service pension schemes. And Grace, is it?
Yes, I mean, I've no further update to give the committee. I'd understood this topic was really just if the committee had any questions or issues that they wished to raise at this point in time. I think the committee has been briefed on this on a number of occasions. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you may have on it.
Okay, the department says it intends to commence an options exercise.
Yes.
Once the regulations have been laid.
Yeah.
What would the specific time frame be for that?
We hope to commence the options exercise really in the next few weeks, because that will, there's a 3-month time period required to do that from start to finish. In terms of laying the regulations, we also hope to do that within the next few weeks as well.
Okay, and will the department be engaging with members of the scheme who are affected by it?
In terms of the options exercise, are you referring to, or
yes.
the change? Yes, we will. There will be detailed packs going out to all those people who are in that tapered group, who the options exercise will apply to actually give them quite detailed personalised financial information to help them to make an informed choice, and then they will also have time to consider that, and that's why there's a 3-month period there. And they may wish to seek independent financial advice on that, because we won't be providing advice, merely information.
And in relation to the changes, would you expect that members will already be aware of that?
The changes in terms of the options exercise or the whole scheme, members will be aware of actually both matters. So members will be aware of the changes that are coming in 2015, and those
Are they aware that the final year is changing to the career average?
Yes, there's been numerous communications on that.
It has been, right.
Yes, to members of the scheme already, and there's also been communication about the options exercises as well too, which is a particular group of members just within the membership of the overall scheme.
Okay. Any questions on that?
No, I'm fine.
None? Okay. Yeah. If members are content, then I'll put the question on that. The committee has considered DFP's proposal for subordinate legislation under the Public Service, Civil Servants and Others Pension Regulations, Northern Ireland 2014, and has no objection to the policy implications of the proposed legislation at this stage. Reid?
Reid.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, is there one other item here? Transition and consequential provisions to be made under the Public Service Pensions NI Act 2014.
I wasn't aware we were dealing with that matter today, and I'm not in a position to.
Okay, so are you in a position to speak to it?
Chair, we were advised by the Departmental Assembly Liaison Officer that this item could be covered if necessary, so there's papers in the pack.
Right, okay.
Page 111 of the pack.
You don't have your pack.
It's a separate piece of subordinate legislation. Just to.
Are you in a position to answer questions on it today?
Well, what's your question?
We try.
We do know that each scheme are laying this consequential, it's transitional consequential. They're technical amendments out of the Public Service Pensions Bill.
Okay. I believe the 4-week consultation period commenced on the 27th of October, and the department expects to lay the rules at the end of November. So, in terms of the proposals, what views have been provided by trade unions, either in response to the consultation or through engagement at the Pensions Forum?
Trade unions were in support of these changes because they were of benefit to members. They saw them as technical in nature and benefit to members.
Okay, can I ask you when the department intends formally to present the SL1 to the committee for consideration before laying the statutory rules?
I think that, again, will be over the next few weeks.
Over the next few weeks, okay. Any other questions on that? Not at the moment. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank
you, and my apologies about that oversight. I'm sure it was entirely down to me.
Okay, well, we'll have the opportunity anyway to discuss it further in the future if necessary.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Members, we move on to item number 11, which is correspondence, and I'll ask the clerk to speak to the following correspondence, beginning with the Minister for Finance and Personnel, transposition of EU procurement directives. That's page 120 to 127 of the text.
Yeah, Chair, that's just an update on the issue in advance of full transposition early next year. Most of the correspondence, I think, is for noting unless members have queries. One or two items just require decisions, Chair. There's correspondence at page 164 in the non-domestic rate revaluation 2015. I give a link to the members will be aware of the output so far. So it's just really to check. I think it comes up later on the work programme, but if members wish to receive a briefing from the officials on that, I think on the 10th of September they'll be available on the 10th. Have you know?
As soon as possible, I think. Judging by the mood on the ground.
Then, Chair, there's a piece of correspondence received at page 170 of the pack. It's from the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform. I contacted the clerk of that committee after receiving the correspondence just to get more detail on it, but basically the proposal is to invite this committee down for an informal meeting discussion on areas of potential mutual interest, probably around 11 a.m. a couple of hours and then followed by a lunch. So we've been just an informal discussion. So
Wednesday the 17th of December?
17th. It's just that's the week of recess, first week of Christmas recess. So bear that in mind, and also the possibility of an additional meeting on the draft budget. But if that date isn't convenient, there would maybe alternatives as well. Sure.
Any views on that?
Well, Chair, probably given the generally heavy work programme, to schedule something during recess seems a reasonable enough way forward in terms of the 17th. I don't know.
Members agreed? Agreed. Okay, thank you. Now we move on to item number 12, which is a committee work programme. And I refer you to the draft work programme, pages 172 to 5 of the pack. It's proposed that the following items be added as mentioned earlier: non-domestic rates revaluation update briefing on the 10th of December, a ministerial briefing on the draft budget 2015-16 at next week's meeting. The Minister has indicated that he's available on that date, which is the 26th of November. Additional research briefings on various strategic budget issues, which will inform members ahead of next week's ministerial briefing. Members agreed?
Agreed. So just that the Minister's coming in next
Wednesday morning. Okay, members agreed. We'll move on to item 13, which is any other business. Is there any other business? If there's not, then we'll move on to item 14, which is the date, time and place of next meeting, 26th November, 10 a.m, room 30. Put the question that the committee does now adjourn.